Thank you for joining us, and thank you for introducing yourselves in the Padlet if you have already done that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, I'll introduce it in a second. Before I begin tonight's session, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all come to this session, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank the elders of the Wurundjeri land, which is where I'm coming to you from today. So my name is Narissa Leung. I am an education consultant here in this wonderful state of Victoria. It's a very free state now of Victoria. As I said, I'm an education consultant. I mainly do work around literacy in schools, and I'm former primary school principal and principal network chair. And if you are wanting to get in contact with me, that's all my contact details and all my pipes and channels are on the screen there. I'm at Auslit Teacher on Facebook and Instagram, and I share mentor texts for teaching reading and writing to students. I don't have an Edumail email, so please don't look for me on Edumail. There is a Narissa who works at Basto that is not me, and she does get a few of my emails. So I am narissaleung@gmail.com. And that is the photo of what I used to look like before the lockdown, when I had nicely brushed hair and I'd been to the hairdresser within the last 6 months. So I thought that would be nice to put up there, just, in case I get to go soon, you'll know what I look like. All right, so tonight, if you haven't been to any of our Literacy Toolkit webinars, then welcome, a big welcome. The good news is it's not just me talking to you for the whole entire night. That's good for you and it's good for me. So basically, I work on the principle that good teaching, we need to try and, replicate that as best as we can in the online situation, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with now that you've finally come off remote teaching. So this is one of my favourite books when it comes to talking about talk in the classroom. And Fisher and Fry say the academic discourse of the classroom, both oral and written, is the conduit for learning. So we need to have as much talk as we can in the classroom. Students must be actively engaged in the academic discourse of the classroom if they're to understand the content. So we're not talking about what we did on the weekend, we're talking about the actual content. Now, you're probably thinking, why am I talking about this? It's because if we're in a face-to-face environment, I would be making sure that we had lots of opportunities for turn and talk so that we could actually get our head around the content that's being presented tonight. Obviously, we're in the online space, so our best way of replicating that classroom talk that is so important, it's the conduit of learning, is to use a back channel or a Padlet. So the address for the Padlet is on the screen there, basto.padlet.org/Sean Goodwin. Sean works at Basto, and I think he just wanted his name to be up in the lights, that's why his name's in there, /LTT for Literacy Teaching Toolkit, HUM for Humanities. Now, on there, we've got some of our department support, or some of our key department personnel and toolkit people. So if you've got questions, put them in the Padlet and hopefully they'll be answered. But otherwise, we'd love you to introduce yourselves, let us know where you're from, what your role is, and that might help us with working through tonight. On the Padlet, you'll also see there was a supporting resources pack. So when we work through the content tonight, I will often say turn to page 2 on the pack and let's have a look at the resource on there. So if you don't have a copy of it, you can go onto the Padlet and you can download a copy from there. That's okay. So that's up there for the whole night. All right. Oh, so I can see a few people introducing themselves. We've got Point Cook Secondary, Hampton Park, Laylaw, Cranbourne, Jewin. Great. Okay, so the understanding goals for tonight. Participants will understand the importance of explicit teaching of disciplinary literacy in the humanities classroom. This is what we're on about, this whole idea of disciplinary literacy, which I might add is not easy to say really quickly. So I'm going to talk a lot about what is disciplinary literacy, what do we mean by it, what does it mean for you if you're a humanities teacher, what does it mean for you if you're maybe a literacy teacher in your school and you've been tasked with the job of getting literacy going across the school. The second understanding goal is that you will develop knowledge of a range of effective disciplinary literacy related teaching practices for the humanities classroom. And finally, that you'll have a better understanding of the supporting resources that are available. I can't teach, I'd love to, but I can't teach you everything there is to know about disciplinary literacy in the humanities classroom in a 2-hour webinar. So this is really a tasting plate. It's or a launch pad, if you will. And I'll let you know some places that you can go to go and further your own knowledge in each of the areas. So the success criteria, you'll be able to describe reasons why the explicit teaching of disciplinary literacy is important. You'll be able to list some practical literacy-related activities for the humanities classroom. You'll be able to reflect on your current practice, and I think that's really important, a really key part of, well, it's always a key part of becoming a better teacher, isn't it? And you'll be able to list some of the supporting resources for ongoing learning. Okay, so our agenda for tonight is that I'm going to start off with talking about that concept of disciplinary literacy. So the what and the why of disciplinary literacy. Then we're going to turn our attention to the brand new and very shiny and exciting literacy teaching toolkit Humanities, which is so exciting that it's just been released. And then we're going to talk about vocabulary instruction in the humanities classroom. And finally, we're going to just do a little light touch on explicit genre instruction in the humanities classroom. Okay, so let's get started with the what and the why of disciplinary literacy. Okay, so, well, we'll start off with this. Given the distinct ways different academic disciplines use language to make their own meanings, students need to develop differentiated literacy skills and strategies for interacting with the texts of each discipline. Okay, so when the Literacy Teaching Toolkit was being developed, the developers wanted to acknowledge the different ways that literacy is used in different curriculum areas. So it's widely acknowledged now that we don't actually interact with text in the exact same way in every discipline, in not just in a school, but outside a school. So there are distinct ways that we interact with texts, for example, in a humanities classroom compared to how we interact with them in a maths classroom. So even the research around this idea of everyone's a teacher of literacy has sort of shifted in the last, I'd say, 10 to 20 years, 15 years. So Unsworth says it's no longer appropriate to talk about literacy across the curriculum. And you might be familiar with this term. There was an enormous push. I think it was about 10 years. I feel like it was about 10 years ago when I was working with some secondary schools. We were always talking about literacy across the curriculum then. So instead, there is a need to delineate curriculum literacies, specifying the interface between a specific curriculum and its literacies, rather than imagining that there's a single literacy that could spread homogeneously across the curriculum. So let me explain what we're talking about here. As I said, I think it was about, maybe it was just over 10 years ago when I was working in high schools, and we were talking about, everyone's a teacher of literacy and literacy across the curriculum. And at that stage, we were in the left column here with this idea of general literacy. So we were teaching comprehension strategies that every curriculum area could be teaching their students. So we were looking at predicting, and we're going to teach our students across the school how they could predict in their different areas and how they could question and how they could infer. And that came from the research way back on what do proficient readers do. And the research demonstrated that proficient readers have about 9 key strategies that they repeat over and over. So predicting, questioning, summarising, inferring, making connections, all of these types of things. So the thought was that if we teach our students in every curriculum area how to do these things, then they'd easily understand everything that they're reading in those content areas. There was the idea there was writing to learn. So again, we're encouraging writing across the curriculum. We had a bit of a focus on vocabulary instruction, but probably wasn't anywhere near as in-depth as it needed to be. And in the schools that I was working in, we didn't do a lot of work on accountable talk and building substantive conversations back then. But we've turned our attention now, and the research is turning its attention now to this idea of disciplinary literacy. So that is, we're saying, and the research now recognises that as a teacher of geography or as a teacher of history, You are an expert in your field. You are the best placed person to know how a historian reads texts, different texts. If you're a geography teacher or you're interested in geography, you're best placed to know what type of writing is involved in that area. So it's more focused on the way the experts in the discipline, how they think, how they speak, how they read, and how they write. Okay. It also identifies that in disciplines, the language features of text are different. And it's different depending on the discipline. So the language features of a maths text will be very different to the language features of a civics and citizenship book or text. Okay. And then finally, I think this is the absolute key, is that idea of that discipline specific vocabulary. So, and how do we get our students to get their heads around that idea of the vocabulary that when I open up the door to the history classroom, here's all of the vocabulary that's going to be relevant to the learning that I do in here, which is very different to the vocabulary that I need to get my head around in the science classroom. So let's start with the provocation. Well, why doesn't the English teacher teach all of this? Like, surely it's their job. They're a teacher of English. Why do I've got all of my content to teach as it is, all my humanities content. I can't teach your English content as well. Why isn't the English teacher teaching all of these skills to the students? So this is the provocation that I want to start with, because I think it's something that, especially in secondary schools, we have to tackle, and we've got to put it out there for discussion. And we need to build teacher understanding and content knowledge around why it isn't okay to expect the literacy teacher or the English teacher to be held responsible to build the literacy skills required for our students to be successful in the humanities classroom. So why isn't it their job? Okay, so just having a look, disciplinary literacy. Disciplinary literacy refers to the learner's ability to read, write, and speak in ways that are valued and used by people in a given discipline. That is, to think like mathematicians, read like historians, and write like scientists. And as I said before, who is the person who is best placed to decide or to know how experts in the field read, write, and speak in ways that are valued by that field? Well, that's your content area, so you are the best person to know that. Now, when it comes to disciplinary literacy, Shanahan have written quite a number of books about this. They say that disciplinary literacy recognises that literate strategies differ across the disciplines. So where before we might have thought, well, let's teach everyone how to predict in every content area, because we thought that the comprehension strategies, and the comprehension strategies still are used across all of the, they're used anytime you read, to be honest. But it's become apparent that there's the way that you read and the strategies that you require when you are reading in a specific discipline, they're nuanced. There are different skills and knowledge sets that we call on when we're reading texts in different curriculum areas. So the literate strategies differ. We're going to look more at that one in a second. Disciplinary literacy means that literate strategies and discipline-specific content are intertwined. So, okay, that's interesting, because that means that it's not a case of, oh, I've got to teach all of this humanities content and now you want me to teach all of this other content. Actually, no. I think this is the absolute key to disciplinary literacy, is that our teachers need to understand that by teaching the literate strategies, our students will have much greater access to the discipline-specific content. So if they don't have the strategies to read and write and think like a humanitarian or like a geography user, then they're not going to be able to really deeply understand the content that we need them to understand. The third dot point, disciplinary literacy enables students to develop their content knowledge, skills and understanding to become experts within a discipline. So it's actually a means towards an end. It's not a separate thing that we have to teach in addition to what we're originally teaching. It's that what we're originally teaching our kids to really enable success of our students to get that learning is that we've got to be helping them with these literate strategies and building their capacity in this area. So when we're looking at this idea of literate strategies differ across the disciplines, this is what I think can help us to understand and to answer that question, well, why isn't the English teacher teaching this? I'm busy. So I think when we pull this apart like this is where it makes it really clear about why we can't just leave it all up to the job of the English teacher. Okay, so let's look at reading to start off with. And this is in an English classroom. So we want to look at some of the skills that our students will need to engage in to be successful in an English classroom. And this comes from Lenton Voigt's work. They've got a book called Disciplinary Literacy in Action. And I'll put that book up at the end if you're interested in it. So if we're in an English classroom and we're reading in an English classroom, what are we likely to be doing? Well, our students are likely to be finding meaning through literary techniques. So when we're reading, firstly in an English classroom, we're more likely to be encountering narrative texts. So texts that are written to entertain, yeah? So those texts are written in a specific way, and they probably include a lot of literary techniques. They've got alliteration, they've got metaphor, they've got simile, they've got all these beautiful crafting elements to create a beautiful story that the reader is then required to follow. So our readers they're identifying themes in the text. So they're probably reading a narrative, a novel, and they're trying to work out what are the major themes that are coming up in this novel. They're recognising bias, so whether you can trust the narrator in the story. So Lemony Snicket's probably a good example of that, a well-known text where you can't trust the narrator because he is full of it. And whatever he says, that he's saying it with a lot of sarcasm and he's not really telling the truth. They are summarising, synthesising, analysing and evaluating. So as they're reading the text, they're thinking, okay, what's happening in the story so far? All right, so I'm just going to do a quick summary so I know where I'm up to. So, when I'm reading my novel every night before I go to bed, I think, okay, what's happened so far? Where am I again in the story? Oh, yeah, that's right. They're up to the whatever part. I'm reading Nevermore at the moment. So I'm thinking, oh, yeah, they've just got off the light rail system. They're synthesising. Oh, I used to think this about that main character, and then they've done this, so now I'm thinking this, and my thinking's changing as the story's moving along, okay? They're making connections. So as they're reading, as I'm reading Nevermore at the moment, I'm thinking, oh, this is really similar to Harry Potter, or this is really similar to Alice in Wonderland, or it makes me think of this other text that I read, or this movie that I watched, or this character reminds me of this character in this book. So we're making lots of connections with other texts, with ourselves, and with things that are going on out in the world. Our readers, even though they might not talk about it, they're paying attention to the craft. So the craft we're talking about, when you read a sentence and you think, wow, that was so powerful, I just love that sentence. And then if you're anything like me, I then read it to my husband, so I've just got to share it with him. I just think, have a listen to this. So we're paying attention to the craft. We're thinking, how did the writer do that? So I'm going to reread that and find out how did they do that, because I might want to do that in my own writing. So they recognise elements of stories, poems and novels. We understand that they generally have a beginning, middle and an end. It's generally in that order unless it's a flashback, but we know that that's a thing, so we know how that works. And we're questioning through a critical lens. So these are some, not all, some of the skills that our students are developing when they're learning about reading in the English classroom or to be successful in the English classroom. All right. What about in the humanities classroom? What's happening there in terms of the skills for reading? Okay, so what I've done is I'm just going to use history as an example. Otherwise I'll be here all night if I go through all four of them. My apologies. So when we're reading in history, it's unlikely, it's less likely that we're going to be reading narrative. We might be reading a historical narrative, but when we're reading, we're identifying bias to see who's writing this version of the history and what do they know about it, what's their background. We're untangling conflicting perspectives and claims. So if I'm reading about a historical event, I'm thinking, okay, well, this person has written their account. Well, were they even there on the day that it happened? No, but their mum's sister was. but then that conflicts with what this person says and they were there. Actually, there's a lot of this going on in the media at the moment, right now. They're corroborating information and sources. So we're thinking, how does this, so I thought this about the event, and now that I'm reading this, I'm starting to think, maybe this has changed, maybe this is happening. So I'm starting to, work out how do all of these things come into alignment, which is very different when we're reading a narrative in the English classroom, because we're looking at something that more than likely isn't an actual event. It's a fictional event. Whereas here, we're trying to piece together what actually happened. What other sources of information do I need to really get my head around it? We're comparing and contrasting events, accounts, perspectives, documents, and visuals. So we're in the English classroom, we're usually just going to read the one text. If I'm reading Nevermore, I'm not going to go and read 3 different books about the same topic, because that's its own topic. Whereas when I'm reading in history, I'm reading usually with a specific purpose of trying to find out information about maybe a specific event or person. And it's viewed, the more text or the more access I can get to different perspectives is better for me as a reader to build my understanding. So I need to infer what is not explicit. I've got to determine the meanings of words. And sometimes that's hard because say, for example, in a history account, the words that people have used, say, in their diary writing, like sometimes I find a real challenge to read historical diary entries because the language that we use changes, and so does the context in which we use those words. So it's not just a matter of understanding all words, it's thinking, okay, what did that mean in that context back then when they were writing that? And also, on top of all of that, we've then got to there's a big focus on visual. So we've got to be able to understand, how do we deconstruct maps? How do we read charts? How do we read infographics and photographs? And that's a whole other skill that we're not necessarily going to have a strong focus on in the English classroom. So can you see some of the differences here? And if you think about this is just history. So then we're talking about, what does this mean for civics? What does this mean for geography? What does it mean for economics? What does the reading look like in those classrooms? And then we're talking about maths and science and all of these. So if we're saying one teacher has to be teaching all of these different skills, we've really got to be wondering, how would they be able to do that? Now, if you look at writing, goodness, that was just reading. Let's look at writing. So in the English classroom, a lot of the writing that we're doing, probably because it's driven by NAPLAN, is around writing narratives and persuasive. So when we're writing, we're teaching our students about drafting, revising, and editing, the process of writing that writers go through. We're looking, and this is a big difference to history classrooms, or indeed all humanities classrooms. We're looking at the flexible use of organisation. So where in the English classroom, we're going to celebrate and actually avoid, because we don't want to see formulaic writing, because when you're reading a narrative, you want to be surprised, you want to be entertained, and formulaic writing is the absolute killer of surprise and entertainment. So in the English classroom, we're going to teach our kids the basic structure for writing a narrative or a persuasive piece or anything like that. But then we're going to encourage our students to break the rules, because we want them to keep the reader's attention. Now, that's really different to a humanities classroom, or imagine in an economics classroom where we've said to the students, no, break all the rules. Don't worry about writing the report up in this specific fashion. Completely different. So in English, we're talking about literary devices. We're talking about having beautiful poetic language and really molding words to have that, create that beautiful sense of sentence fluency, and for the reader's benefit, the pleasure of reading. We're looking at using credible evidence, which I would say goes across all key learning areas. Using mentor texts. I'm going to talk about mentor texts later, but mentor texts, I would say I want them to be seen across all areas. So what I'm talking about with mentor texts is I'm saying, let's look at some examples of the text that we're talking about. So if we want our students to write a financial report in economics, then they need to see some. Show me some examples of them before you ask me to write one. and that's a mentor text. It's a text that we look at to go, oh, that's what it looks like. So we adapt communication for various audiences. So if we're in the English classroom, if we're writing to students in the primary school, we're going to change our language. We're going to change the topics that we're writing about. Whereas if we're writing my husband's grandma is getting a letter from the Queen this week. She's turning 100. That will have been adapted for the audience. It's a very formal reason. So, that she's not going to, I don't suspect Lizzie will use informal language when she writes her congratulations letter. And then employ effective techniques for argumentation. Now, the techniques that you use in an English classroom, there'll be some crossover, but it's not, I wouldn't say you could just completely pick it up and plonk that into a historical persuasive piece. In historical writing, our students need to know how to create timelines with accompanying narratives. They've got to write in chronological order. It is so important. Whereas in the English classroom, chronological order, it has a focus, but we might write in flashbacks. We can actually move the time around. Whereas in historical writing, it is traditional to see that thing is written in chronological order. And it might actually include a visual timeline to even support it. We're going to use information and evidence from multiple sources and teach our students how to use that. Not too much, as in we don't want to, it's not a copy and paste from the internet here. We're going to use little snippets and then pull that together and synthesize it into our own piece. We will teach them to organize conflicting ideas or perspectives into a whole piece. So how do we say, lots of people thought this at the time. There were a bunch of people who actually thought this, and this is why they thought it, but we're focusing on this other group here. Using the past as a mirror to the present, which is probably what I wish I had my history teacher in high school had have taught us about that, because at the time I remember thinking, oh, why am I learning this? Now I love it. Summarizing social or political consequences of an event. So that idea to read lots of different pieces of accounts and then synthesize them and summarize them into a shorter version so that they can be included in, your piece of writing for history. And understanding how to use, well, firstly, how to source, which I don't think we do enough explicit instruction, how to source primary and secondary sources, and then how do we use those in our writing. So there are a lot of differences here in what our student needs to be able to do to be successful in using writing in an English classroom as opposed to a history classroom. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about disciplinary literacy. So we're saying that as a teacher of history, you are best placed to know what are the skills, what are the things that our students need to be able to do in literature-wise, to be able to be successful historians or to be able to be successful at understanding history and the content that's been, provided in that. So, because you are the experts, I am going to put this question out here. I want you to put your responses in the Padlet. I'm going to get my little Padlet gurus to put a little question in there. If you had to name the most important literacy-related skill that students need in your humanities area, so whether that's economics or geography or history or civics, what would it be? So what's the thing that you just think, oh my goodness, the kids, they always struggle with this, or I'm really having trouble getting them to understand this. So what are the literacy related skills that you think that your students really need to build in order to be successful in your content area? I'm going to put my timer on for 2 minutes and I would like to see your responses in the chat. Let's have a look. All right. Just having a little read of your comments in the chats. So interesting to see that lots of people referred to inferring as a challenge that is constantly coming up. The reason I say this is interesting is because when I ask primary teachers the same thing, they are saying the same. They're saying our kids are really struggling with inferring. So it's not just in high school that that's a problem. I will talk a little bit about that when we get up to talking about vocabulary. I also think it's really interesting that a few of you have mentioned that idea of recognizing unconscious bias. And what an exciting time in our world that we're starting to finally pay attention to this. And we're starting to have some more resources come out to help us to develop our ability to recognize unconscious bias in school. And I would say in the workplace for adults as well, which is that's exciting, I think. What a time. Comprehension of different sources, written, visual, and graphic. Yeah, and when you start to really unpack the text and have a look at it from a comprehension point of view, you can see actually just how complex these texts are, especially in the area of humanities. So I would absolutely agree with yours. Oh, interesting. Retrieving directly stated information. Right. All right. So let's keep those in our mind and move forward. The thing is, we can't expect our students to just know all of these discipline-specific reading and writing skills. We have to guide them through a gradual release of responsibility. So I am an enormous fan of gradual release of responsibility. I talk about it any opportunity I can because all good teaching is based on this model. This is the version, the gradual release of responsibility was originally created by Pearson and Gallagher back in the 80s. This is Fisher and Fry's version of it. They've just added an extra layer. Initially, it had 3 layers. So the idea is that when we're first introducing a concept, that we're going to be the responsibility is going to be more on the teacher than it is on the students. So we're going to have more of a I do and you watch. And we're going to move our students down to a point where they're able to do the tasks independently. Now, these 4 phases here, the focus, the guided instruction, collaborative and independent, these are not linear. So it doesn't mean that every time you're teaching a lesson, you must work your way through these phases. And I think that's actually a misconception that people have about the model. Fisher and Fry say that it's not linear, but over the course of a unit, our students need to engage in all 4 phases if we're expecting them to take on the learning and for it to be portable so that they can carry that learning and apply it to other situations. So I absolutely love this model because I think when something's going wrong with the learning in the classroom, I like to think about, reflect back on my own role and say, well, how have I built my students' capacity to be successful in that area? So if I'm having trouble with, let's have a look at these, perspective, if my students are really struggling to identify perspective in the reading, what have I done to build their skills in this area? So what's been my role in this? Or have I just expected them to go straight down to that independent phase and know how to do it? So do I need to pull myself back up to the top of this diagram and go back into more modeling, more explicit teaching, some think alouds? So as teachers of humanities, I really encourage you to become metacognitive. So really aware of your own thinking when you're reading and you're writing in your subject area. So reading's a really good example. Okay, so firstly think, what do I read in this subject area? Is it all textbooks? Actually, no, most of it's probably online nowadays. Welcome to the online world. So when I do, let's say, for example, when I am reading a website and I'm finding out, I don't know, the latest information on something, I don't know, geography-wise, how do I read that website? Do I read it from top to bottom? Do I skim the website? Do I look for subheadings that I think are going to be answering the question that I've got? Do I look at the visuals first, or do I look at the text first? And being really conscious of how actually do I do it as an expert in the field? How do I do it? What do I do? And why don't I read all of that text? Why do I skim to the bottom where it just gets, it has the subheading that I'm interested in? Why don't I look at read all of every detail on the visuals? So, and then being explicit to the students I say, let them in on the secret, so that to help them to interact with the text in the exact same way that you, the expert, have, so they can start to learn the same tricks and tips that you engage in yourself. So the same with writing. When you're writing in a subject area, what knowledge do you call on? So how do you work out how you're going to structure your piece? Although I know teachers, we're all readers, but we're not all writers. My first request would be, please write in your own subject area, so you can see before you ask kids to write an essay about a topic, have a go at writing it yourself to see what knowledge sets do I call on? What research did I need to do? How did I do that research? So you can use that, give advice to your kids about how to do the same thing. All right, so let's get into exploring the toolkit. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just give a little bit of background knowledge on what the toolkit is. It's all freely available on the Victorian Department website. It's open 24/7. There's no lockdown or shutdown ever on the Literacy Teaching Toolkit, which is fantastic. And you can take as many friends as you like to go and have a look at it. So unlike the primary version, which is broken up into the modes, so in the primary version, there's a section on reading and everything you'd need to know about teaching reading. Then there's a section on writing and everything you'd need to know about that. In the secondary version, well, of course, we couldn't do that, because we know that every curriculum area has a different, if we're on about disciplinary literacy, that's why they've all been separated into the disciplines. So you can see here, we've got so far we've had literacy in English has been released, maths, technologies, science, and the latest one to be released is humanities. We have the arts and health and PE coming later. It says later in 2020, so I'm going to say later in 2020. Could be really later in 2020. But let's celebrate that literacy in humanities is here. Now, just before we move on, if you are in the role of maybe a Mylands teacher in a secondary school, or if you're a literacy leader in a secondary school, I ask you to please go and have a look at the primary toolkit, go and look at the reading and the writing teaching practices, because they are the places that you'll go when you're working with intervention students, working with struggling readers and writers. It has some really fantastic resources in there that you could absolutely pull up to the secondary level. So don't just discredit it because it says primary. There are lots of great resources in there that could absolutely be used in a secondary setting. Okay, but tonight we're talking about humanities, so let's do that. Now, in the humanities toolkit, there are 4 key learning areas, and apologies if you are sitting there thinking, well, duh, I'm a humanities teacher. Just in case we've got literacy experts in here, then I'll just let you know. Civics and citizenship, economics and business, history and geography. Okay. Now, the reason also that I've alerted you to the fact that there are 4 is because in the toolkit, the humanities section, there's a section for each of these. So each of you get equal amounts of love and support and resources, which is great. Now, when you go into the section for whichever key learning area you're looking at there, all of them are set out in the same way. So that is, and I've got an example on the screen here. So I've pulled this from the economics and business, but it's set out in the same way for humanities and the rest of them. History and the rest of them. So there are 4 sections, and this is the same when you go to science and maths and English as well. There are 4 sections, and I'm going to take you through what each of these 4 sections are. We start off with the introduction, and in the introduction, this part gives a broad overview of what to expect for literacy in this discipline. Okay, so it usually tells you if there's, let's have a look actually. This is what it looks like on the economics and business version. So when you get into the introduction, you can go in and find out about literacy in economics and business, gives you a bit of an overview about what to expect. Sometimes it includes a definition to help clear up potential misunderstandings. So let's say, for example, in geography. So in geography, there's geographical literacy versus literacy in geography. Well, you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Well, good question. Go and have a look. It's on the toolkit. Don't look right now. Look after this. So if there's any definitions that need to be cleared up, that happens on this page as well. It also contains info on the literate practices that are related to the Victorian curriculum. So here you can see literate demands in economics and business, just to give you a bit of an overview about, you know that page when I talked about history writing versus English writing, it sort of says this is what you're going to expect you need to expect in reading and writing in this curriculum area. Then we've got literacy in the Victorian curriculum, economics and business. And so I guess it helps you to understand how teaching the literacy is actually helping you to teach your content, your humanities content, because it shows you the links there. So I think that's important. So every one of them has this first page, this introduction page. Okay, so back to the main page here. The second row there is developing understanding in economics and business, civics, history, etc. The developing understanding phase, this is all about, I think of it as sort of the receptive stuff. So when you're trying to fill their heads full of all the information they need to know about your content area. So what are the literacy skills that the students need in order for this, in this developing, when they're building their knowledge around the unit that you're presenting them, what are the skills that they need? So when they're learning new knowledge, so they're receptive. So if we have a look at the example from economics and business, it's broken into 3 sections. So actually they're all pretty much the same. Introducing the language of the curriculum area, reading and interpreting data. Now that's specific to economics and business, and reading the written language. So if we to look at these in further deeper, in the introducing the business language, there's joint construction of definitions for vocabulary, and there's using teacher talk to promote specific language. Now, sometimes there are practical activities, sometimes there are step-by-step, sometimes there are links to other resources when you go into these pages. So one of these pages actually has a really great link to a word wall, a downloadable PDF, which I thought was fantastic. In the reading and interpreting data, this is just for the economics and business, there's the importance of data literacy, unpacking visual representation. So again, there's some support, some ideas, resources for how do we go about building our students' ability to unpack those visual representations, and then comparing and contrasting statements about data. That sort of goes into the vocabulary. If we want our kids to compare and contrast, what are the words that they're likely to be using, or we expect to see, or they're expecting to read in texts. And finally, for the reading the written language in the economics classroom, explicitly teaching how to read and respond to a case study. And there's a really great resource for helping to build your capacity to build the student knowledge around this. Okay, so that's the type of thing that you're expecting in this developing understanding. It's really building your knowledge around, or helping kids to use literacy to build their content knowledge. Okay, so the first section's the intro, the overview, then we're building knowledge. Well, the third section is all about producing. So now that we've built your knowledge and you've got all this great content knowledge, we expect you to produce. So you might be writing or speaking or creating in the content area about the unit of work. Does that make sense? Let's have a look at some of the things. So in economics and business, the example, so drawing visual representations of economic and business concepts. So there's some advice and some little pictures as well about using shorthand notation. So something that you might consider explicitly teaching students to help them with their visual representations. There's using graphic organisers to demonstrate economic understanding. In writing comparisons and contrasts, because that's something you're likely to be doing in the economics classroom, there's strategies for how to write comparison and contrast pieces. And there's also a suggestion of a jigsaw activity to, again, build the student's capacity to write a compare and contrast piece of writing. And the third one, writing recommendations with explanations. So we're expecting our students to write in this text type. So we've got to build their knowledge of how to do that. So in economics and business, they're going to use a framework to structure a recommendation. And there's an example of how you can teach them gradual release of responsibility, how you can teach them to structure a recommendation with explanation. Explicitly teaching the language features, again, thinking about gradual release of responsibility, and using a sample or mentor text to model how to write a recommendation. So some really great and supportive resources in here to help build your students' capacity to be successful at producing in the content area. And then the last section, so there's the intro, the building the knowledge, the producing, and then the final row is always about pulling the whole thing together. And I sort of think like with a nice little bow on the top. So this actually shows you an example of what it could look like from Go to Woe for, a whole unit. And there are some really amazing, or some really solid units in here. So I think this is definitely worth having a look at. In the economics and business version, that's about, I think they're writing what was it? They're writing a business report. That's right. And it shows you teaches the students how to construct the business report so they can be successful at writing one. So I definitely recommend having a look at that fourth section. Now, you're sitting there thinking, well, that's great. Everyone knows what's in economics and business, but I teach history. Don't worry, I've got you covered. So in the supporting resources pack, which was, there's the link, I think it was emailed out, and there's a link in the Padlet as well. I have done a very quick mud map of the headings for each of the sections for each of the areas. So civics, economics, geography, and history. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to read through the document so you can see the types of resources or the areas that the literacy toolkit covers. So you can potentially highlight and think, yeah, I might go and have a look at that one, or this one interests me, that sort of thing. So when I give you 3 minutes, I want you to think about what do you notice, what do you like, and what do you wonder? And I'd like you to share your thoughts in the chat. So this is on page 2 of the supporting resources. So have a look at all of them to see what are the similarities and differences, what's the type of content that you're likely to be able to access in that toolkit. All right, I'll see you in 3 minutes. Okay. Hopefully that was enough time. I know it was 3 minutes is a very quick amount of time when you're asked to read something. Not so quick when you're browsing Facebook, but very quick when you're asked to read a document. I noticed had one point out in the chat. It's interesting that critical reading skills are an explicit part of only the Civics and Citizenship Toolkit, but that writing recommendations and constructing arguments in the other areas imply critical reading in order to be able to achieve them. It shows the necessity of treating the humanities areas as interdependent. Yes. The other thing I would say about that is that I strongly recommend that you use the entire secondary toolkit. Just because you're a humanities teacher doesn't mean you shouldn't go through the science. In fact, you should, especially if you're a geography teacher, you should go through the science part of the toolkit because there is so much crossover. And especially when we talk to you about vocabulary, there are some absolutely brilliant activities and resources in the other areas of the toolkit. So I think the idea when it was being constructed is that those things wouldn't be replicated over and over and over again so that you can access them across the toolkit. So don't only look at the humanities. There's so much goodness in the whole entire toolkit. So have a look through all of the toolkit. All right, so any other comments in the chat? Probably just got some things that you'd like to go and have a look at. Don't look at them yet. You can look at them afterwards. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you some time to reflect now because I've given you a lot of information about disciplinary literacy, how it's different from general literacy, and then we've had a look at the toolkit and what it might be able to offer you in terms of support and resources for using more or focusing more on disciplinary literacy in the humanities classroom. So I want you now, because reflection is a very important part of teaching, I want you to think now, well, so what? What does that mean for you in your current teaching? What did you agree with? What do you think? Oh, okay, maybe I need to investigate that a little bit more. I am going to give you 3 minutes just to think about, just to sit and process some of that. And I've spoken to you for an hour, so some of the information that we've talked about so far. And this is on page 1 of your resource pack. I would like to know your triangle response. So what is the most important thing that you've learned so far about disciplinary literacy, and particularly as it relates to the humanities classroom? So I'll put my timer on for 3 minutes and I'll see you then. right. That's our 3 minutes. So hopefully you've been able to do a bit of reflecting about the learning so far. I just had a caught up on a couple of the comments in the chat. I see we have a Mylands teacher with us who does strongly recommend going into the primary toolkit and has found it very helpful, especially if you're looking at those intervention students and knowing some of the reading and writing strategies that can help those students, because as this teacher has rightly pointed out, secondary teachers haven't been trained in the basics of how to teach reading. So they're mainly focused on, how to use reading to access the content knowledge. So thank you for that. Oh, I see some more people have put some comments in the chat. Good. Okay, let's move on. Now I want to talk to you about vocabulary instruction in the humanities classroom. And the reason that I've chosen to zoom in specifically on vocabulary is because, well, firstly, it's highlighted in all of the learning areas related to humanities. You will have seen it across in that developing understanding. It was technical vocabulary or content-specific vocabulary was mentioned in each of the areas. The other reason is because I think it's an area, particularly in secondary school, where teachers can trial the strategies for talking about vocabulary with it's very low costs, but very high, it pays high dividends. So you get good bang for your buck when you're talking about building vocabulary knowledge, particularly in the secondary setting. And the third is because the research supports it. So why not? There's 3 good reasons for talking about vocabulary instruction in the humanities classroom. All right, let's have a look. I've pulled 3 snippets from the toolkit just relating to vocabulary, because specific to humanities classrooms. So first, in civics and citizenship, students are exposed to vocabulary that uses quite sophisticated and complex abstraction, such as democracy, freedom, and identity. Now, one thing I will say about this is because I found as a proficient reader, we get ourselves into this blind spot where we can't remember, because it's so second nature to us, we can't remember what it was like when we were first learning about all of these concepts. Yeah. So because it's our field and it's our knowledge, we think, well, democracy, well, everyone knows that. So it is an area to be conscious of, to think, well, that's, as a beginner, what might a beginner struggle with? Which terms might be complex for them? Students need to understand the meaning of specific disciplinary vocabulary across multiple contexts as they read, listen to, write, view and write about economic and business decisions, actions, issues and problems across a range of text types. And the third little snippet that I've grabbed, students must learn new terminology if they are to develop their understanding of historical concepts. Historical language presents novel challenges for students. Well, even the word novel, there's a good example of a word that has multiple meanings. Students must understand discipline-specific terminology in contemporary texts and how words are used and have meanings in primary sources. So there's 3 little snippets that I've grabbed about the importance of vocabulary in the humanities classroom. Now, when we come to talking about why teaching vocabulary, well, I really love this quote. This is from Templeton and co. There's about 10 co-authors of this book, and I got to meet about 7 of them last year, which is exciting. But when you teach your students the vocabulary of history, civics, economics, and geography, you are not solely teaching vocabulary terms to be memorized for a test. Rather, you are teaching students deep conceptual understandings that can serve as the foundation for future learning. You are teaching them to use a collective, constructed memory as a guide to future personal decision-making and public action. Oh my goodness, we need this right now, don't we? Perhaps most importantly, you are teaching students how to use the powerful tools of language to reason, research, question, debate, analyze, synthesize, and compromise. Skills necessary to be informed and contributing citizens in a vibrant democracy. Oh, cut that out and put it on the wall. That is our why. That's our reminder about Why do I need to spend precious minutes in my humanities classroom explicitly teaching the vocabulary? Why? Because this is the end point. This is where we're heading to. And we've got to understand that that vocabulary instruction is an investment that will pay a big dividend if we get it right. Okay. Now, the other why, if I haven't convinced you already, putting a persuasive argument forward here, is, and this is from Mazzano and Pickering's book, given the importance of academic background knowledge and the fact that vocabulary is such an essential aspect of it, one of the most crucial services that teachers can provide, particularly for students who don't come from academically advantaged backgrounds, and I would add in there, particularly for students who come from an EAL background where they might have low technical vocabulary knowledge, is systematic instruction in vocabulary. It's so important. So we've got to make sure that we are systematically instructing our students, giving them that vocabulary instruction, building their background knowledge required to be able to access the comprehension. And in fact, there's research that says that that vocabulary knowledge was the strongest predictor of comprehension. And, you know, if you need any more arguments about why we need to spend time on vocabulary, this is the final quote that I've got on this. Vocabulary knowledge is content knowledge. And this is for if you are finding yourself in a position where you are, say, a literacy leader and you're trying to work with content area teachers and you're trying to put the case forward for why they need to eat or quarantine precious minutes in their lessons for explicit vocabulary instruction. Part of the reason that you have to put that case forward in the first place is because teachers often see it as an extra, see it as something additional to the content. What our teachers need to understand is that vocabulary knowledge is content knowledge. If our kids don't understand these specific words, then they're not going to access the content. So it's not that I have to give up my teaching time to teach something that's unrelated. It is actually helping you to achieve your task of building their knowledge in your geography classroom or your history classroom. Research reveals that vocabulary knowledge is the single best indicator of students' reading ability, comprehension, and familiarity with academic discourse. And because of this, vocabulary knowledge is one of the best predictors of student success in school. Whoa, that is big. That's really big. Vocabulary knowledge is one of the best predictors of student success in school. And there's a whole bunch of research that underpins that talks about that idea of the language of academia and how if we don't build our student knowledge in academia, then our students aren't going to be successful in that world. Okay, so we've got the research on it. How do we teach it? What's the best way to teach it? Well, thanks for asking. Okay, so firstly, contrary to what people think, the research shows that we actually we don't learn words one at a time. Usually when we learn a new word, we can use generative morphology, which is something I'm going to talk about in a minute, to learn other words as well. It gives us a bit of a leg up into learning other words. Rich oral language plays a critical role in learning new vocabulary. And if you think about it, we are teaching our kids, we don't just want them to read these words, we want them to write them. And if you can't speak it, then you're not going to write it. Okay, so rich oral language is a really important part of this. We need 12 to 15 exposures to new words. 12 to 15 exposures. Guess that rules out copying the definition off the board once. So, that could be step one, and where are your other 11 exposures? So exposures, it's seeing it, it's hearing it, it's even having a go at writing it, 12 to 15. I always have to remind my husband of this because he just has, I don't know where he found his vocabulary, but it's broader than mine. And he's constantly saying new words to me, and he'll say, I already told you what that one means. And I have to keep saying, yeah, but you've only told me 4 times. You're going to tell me another 8 until I remember it. Then the final point, new words must be read, heard, spoken, and written. So there are some implications for how to teach the words then. If new words have to be read, heard, spoken, and written, it's not just a matter of look it up in the dictionary. It's not just a matter of copy it off the board. So we've got to be a bit more creative about how we go about explicit instruction in vocabulary. This is important. While it may be tempting to introduce the entire list of new vocabulary from a chapter in a content text, it's more effective to teach fewer words well than several words less well. So I'm always banging on about do less and do it well. So in order to teach fewer words but teach them well, we've got to be selective about the words that we're teaching our students. Now, some of you may be familiar with this concept. Others, it might be new to you. That's totally fine. This is Beck McCown, their work on tiers of vocabulary. So they've done a whole bunch of research on vocabulary instruction, and they came up with this concept of having tiers of words. Now, on the first tier is everyday language. So we're looking at a lot of them are nouns. I always say these are the types of words that our kids are going to hear out in the yard. You know, they're going to be when they're walking around, or whatever teenagers do at lunchtime these days, when they're sitting around, you know, chatting. They're the words that's likely to be flying around in the air. Tier 1 vocabulary. So every day, I say like talk words, these are. Now, oops, gone backwards now. Tier 2, this is the next step up. This is the start of academic vocabulary. So the vocabulary in here, we're more likely to come across these words in written texts than we are in spoken language. So an example, a very basic example, tier 1, we're sitting around, you're saying, pass me the, I'm gonna put some salt on my chips. So I'm gonna put being the verb, whereas tier 2, that language that we're more likely to see in texts is I'll sprinkle some salt on my chips. Who says that? No one actually says that. So it's in that next level up, that tier 2 level. The other thing about this, and this is one I think that you should be really conscious of, have a look at the examples of the words that I've put on the right there. Analysis, argument, justify. So a lot of the words that we're asking our kids to read, say, especially on assessment pieces, those assessment pieces contain a lot of tier 2 vocabulary. Now, the important thing to know about tier 2 vocabulary is it is not likely for kids to just pick this up as they're walking around the yard. This needs explicit instruction. So when we're saying to our kids, or when our assessment says compare and contrast, our kids need to know what that means. They need to know what we're actually asking them to do. Do we just assume that they know what that means, compare and contrast? What are the words that I'm likely to see if I'm comparing and contrasting? When we say, when it says justify your decision, what does it actually mean if I have to justify my decision? What are you looking for? What does that word mean? And particularly for our EAL learners, this is a real area of challenge. And sometimes it stops our students from accessing the actual assessment because they're not actually realizing what are they being asked to do here. So that tier 2 language is really important to identify. And then tier 3 subject-specific vocabulary. So when we're talking about the language of humanities, we know that geography has a whole bunch of its own vocabulary, as does economics, this is what we're talking about, tier 3 words. So these are the words that we're most likely to come across them only in that domain. So let's say the word ridge in geography, we're probably not going to be talking about, or if we're talking about a ridge out in in my everyday life, I'm probably not talking about the same ridge I'm talking about when I'm in a geography classroom. So knowing the 3 tiers, I think helps teachers to better select which words they're going to teach. The other thing is that within these 3 tiers, so I'm recommending that you're choosing your words from tiers 2 and 3 because they're the ones that are going to help. That's what we call academic language. And so we're going to use, within those, we've then got to prioritize. We can't teach every single word the students need to know. So I've sort of got to think, well, in this unit that I'm teaching, which words are absolutely critical for my students to understand? If they don't understand this word, they're not going to understand the whole concept that I'm trying to talk to them about. So I've got to be very critical in our thinking about that. Which words do they need a really deep understanding of, and which ones can they get by with a surface level sort of think it means something around this. So we've got to think critically about the words that our students need access to, how deep do they need to know them? And that'll help us to work out which ones we're going to choose for instruction. Okay, let's have a look at a text. So I've borrowed this book, this text. I just did a little snippet. It's a Year 8 geography textbook. I think it's called Geography for the Australian Classroom, the Australian Curriculum. And so I'm going to read it out to you, and I want you to think about, when we're talking about how important vocabulary knowledge is, what are some of the words in this piece that you think could cause challenge for readers who are coming across this piece of text? I'm going to read it out to you, and put your thinking in the chat if you're quick enough. Landforms at different scales. Landforms comprise the landmass and submarine parts of the Earth's surface and contribute to a sequence of features that can be viewed at different scales. Starting at the smallest scale, weathering environments such as arid, coastal, or glacial will produce different patterns on the surfaces of quartz grains. These grains can be examined using an electron microscope to determine probable past environments that have affected them. How are you going so far? How's your comprehension? Probably dusting, you're thinking, oh gee, I've got to dust off the old geography brain for this. At the next scale, weathering features like honeycombing may occur on cliffed shorelines or in saline, arid environments, or a stream may contain rounded gravels. Individual quartz grains of less than 2 millimeters diameter will be classed as small scale, moving to a sequence of larger features like honeycomb. Wow, I don't think I could have chosen a better piece of text to highlight the importance of vocabulary knowledge. And as I said before, if you're the teacher of geography, you're the expert in this. So you are going to be best placed to work out, of all of those words, and I can see that you've put some of them in the chat. Some people have highlighted some of the challenges that students might have. So we've got weathering, arid, scales, comprise, glacial, gravels, honeycombing, saline. Oh my goodness, there are a lot in this piece of text here. Your challenge as a geography teacher is to work out, well, which words are really critical in here, and which words don't, which words could our students get by if they have a surface level knowledge of it. So some of the challenges, and some of you have pointed these out in the chat. I'm just going to get my little highlighter out here. If we look at a word like submarine, well, if I have a knowledge of submarine and it doesn't have anything to do with landmass, so automatically, if I don't understand the context that this word is now in, and that the image that I've got in my mind isn't fitting the rest of this text here, I'm going to be really confused. So I've got to think, well, as a teacher, is that a really critical element, or do I just need to gloss over that one? Got surface. So we've got there are a lot of words in this text that have double meanings. So we've got scales, even honeycomb. That's something I like to eat. It's nothing to do with, I don't like the rocky stuff. We've got microscope, we're talking about the electron microscope. What other things have we got in here? Scale, cliffed shorelines, arid environments. Arid is a word that I think, technical vocab, that's come up a few times in that piece. So I'm thinking, yeah, maybe that's actually a word that I'm going to need to teach, arid, so that my students can understand and really get into this text. So, and then the other thing I thought this text was a good example of is sometimes when you have a word, great, it's been bolded for us. So that means great, we can usually go somewhere else to help us to better understand the word. Well, if you look over here and see what it says, quartz rock composed of silicon dioxide, a hard mineral that resists weathering. How did that help with your knowledge? I read that and thought, oh my goodness, I need a dictionary to try and work out what it is. That would have been much better off having an image there. Anyway, we're not here to critique the text, are we? But what I wanted to point out is the importance of vocabulary and really working out now, how will I prioritize the words that I'm going to actually teach my students? So I want you to do some thinking in your own subject. I've gone to the Victorian curriculum. I've grabbed levels 7 and 8 of each of the 4 areas: civics, economics, history, and geography. And I've just dumped in the Victorian curriculum standards for each of those. I want you to read through those, even if you're not a year 7 and 8 teacher. I just want you to think about it. Even if you're not a humanities teacher, if you're a literacy teacher, I definitely want you to think about it. What might be some of the vocab required to be successful? So, what might be some of the technical vocab that your students are going to have to understand to be successful with this content? All right. What I want you to do with that in your resource pack, on page 7, I've put a little slot there for 10 words. So I want you to have a go and see if you can come up with up to 10 words that you might need to teach your students. It's not a test, just come up with some words. And then we're going to use those moving forward in some activities. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go through this. I might even shorten the time. I'll give you 4 minutes. So hopefully you're a speed reader. And find some words and write them on page 7 of your resource pack. And I'll be back in 4 minutes. Right. Time is up. I would love to see some of your words in the chat. Did you find that interesting to have a look back through to see, wow, there's some really dense vocabulary required in here. I see someone said for economics and business, constitution, consumers, entrepreneur, justice, society, economic cohesion and perspective. What a great bunch of words for you to pick out. Analyze, yes. Analyze will be in all of them. That's not going to be just specific to one area. So I think that's, if everyone could just count that as a freebie and add it to your list if you didn't have that one down. And that would be a tier 2 word that is really important. Identify, yes, another tier 2 word. So if you're a literacy leader, I think I would do this activity. I'd ask the teachers to bring a textbook that they're currently using with their students, and I would ask them to go through a page in that textbook. So whatever they're about to teach in their next unit, and that will help them to really think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of words in here that my kids need to get their heads around if they're going to be able to really get a hold of that content. So hold on to those words moving forward, and you'll see we're about to have a look at some of the ways that you might be able to actually teach them. Now, Leno and Doherty argue that methods of teaching vocabulary that focus on students copying definitions from a textbook is problematic for 3 reasons. Now, I've already talked a little bit about this, and this is actually in the science part of the literacy toolkit, but I think obviously it's relevant to every part of vocabulary instruction. The first reason is that definitions in isolation can be too broad and too narrow and have no direct link to the topic being taught. Submarine, be a good example of that. If we had a definition of submarine, well, unless it was in that context that we just saw it in, we'd be giving the wrong definition. Students, of course, as we know, can copy the definition absent-mindedly. I love that, just incorrectly, rather than rereading and understanding it. And identifying definitions within a passage of text may lead to incomplete or incorrect definitions. And I see someone put in the chat before asking about, I would absolutely agree. When we're trying to explain a concept, particularly a tier 3 concept, we want to try and avoid as much as possible using tier 2 vocabulary to explain it. Because you saw with the quartz, well, did it really help us to build an understanding of what quartz was? I don't think it did. So one of the recommendations when talking about vocabulary and building, teaching definitions is that we need to be able to teach the word or explain the word using vocabulary that is already accessible by the students. So that is probably, quite often using tier 1 language, unless they've got the tier 2 vocabulary. We just need to make sure that we can define the word using words that are already accessible to them. And that will help us avoid the old dictionary. You know, when you look up a word in the dictionary and then you've got to go and look up that word and then look up that word and then you've forgotten what your first word was because you're still trying to work out what the definition was. Okay, so there's 3 reasons that we can't just give definitions, get them to write them down and then move on. So if that's not how we're teaching vocabulary instruction, what's a more effective way of teaching vocabulary? And we've got to keep in mind, our students need more than 1 exposure to the word. They need 12 to 15 exposures. They need to roll the words around on their tongue. They need to speak them. They need to hear them. They need to see them. So that has implications for how we're going to teach it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to introduce you to is this idea of Mazzano's 6 steps. You may be familiar with this concept. I've got his book down here. I'll put it on the floor. Can't bend down and get it. Anyway, I've got it on the last slide just in case you're interested in this. Mazzano talks about building academic vocabulary, and he has 6 steps that he suggests for teaching new terms to students. Step number 1 is to provide a description, explanation, or example of the new term. Okay, so I've got you might do this before you start teaching a unit. In this unit, we're going to come across some words, so let's have a look at them. And we want to limit the number of words that we're introducing to our students. We don't want to hit them with 20 words before we've started the unit. Next is we're going to ask students to restate the description, the explanation, or the example in their own words. It's so important that they do it in their own words because it means that some type of comprehension has gone on. And if they can't put it into their own words, they don't understand it enough, and they need to ask questions to help us to, provide a better explanation or an image. Third is we want them to construct a picture, a symbol, or a graphic representing the term. if you think about that quartz example, I needed an image. That's what I needed to go, oh, okay, yes, now I understand what you're talking about. So, this idea of getting our students to visually represent the word it's all based in the research around dual coding. So, it means, matching in our head, or this is the simple way that I explain it. We've got the visual, so the actual written word, and then we've got the visual of the image. If we have those two things, I think of it as being they join together so they're really heavy and then they sink deeper into our brain and then we can remember them. That is not how the research books explain it, but that's how I've explained it because I think it works. Whereas if we only give them the written word, it's too light and it can float off into the distance, and we don't, we can forget what that word is. That is exactly what is happening to me when my husband's explaining, his latest word that he's trying to explain to me. He gives me one definition and he doesn't give me an illustration or an image or a graphic or something visual to tie it to sink it down in my brain. It's not that I'm not good at learning the words. Absolutely not. All right, so number 4, engage students periodically in activities that help them to add to their knowledge of the terms in their notebooks. He says our students need to play with the words. This is part of having repeated exposure to the words. So we've got to think of ways that we can, we can't just teach them all in one lesson and that's it. We have to bring them up again and use them in different ways. Periodically, I ask students to discuss the terms with one another. We've got to talk about them. We have to say them. We've got to roll them around on our tongue. So one activity that I saw I think it was in Shanahan's book for this, was that they suggested, say, in a history classroom, if you've introduced a bunch of terms that you're going to be using across the unit, then the first activity the students did when they came into the room was the teacher said you need to choose 5 of the vocab words that we've introduced, and you've got to match them with some of the photographs that I've got on the table here, and you have to say how those two things link. So I really like that idea because it's the visual, it's the words, so we're constantly rolling those words around, and we've got to justify how those two things are possibly linked so we know our students have a deeper understanding of the word. And number 6, involves students periodically in games that allow them to play with the terms. And he has a whole bunch of different ideas for games, but don't go too crazy. It's not, when he says games, it's not really sort of Wheel of Fortune, big excitement games. It's just, we just want them to interact with the words on a regular basis, and besides just reading them in the textbooks. So if you want more information on him, on his 6 steps, and he also has some suggestions for, if the word lists for what words that you might consider teaching. I've got his book at the end. Now, a second way of introducing, or I guess it's not a second way, it's another way, or a part of how Mazzano is talking about it, so introducing it to our students and getting them to play with it, is to use the Freya model. So if you're not familiar with the Freya model, I've just made a little quick animation video, and this will explain to you. Hopefully the sound works on this. If it doesn't, it's just the background music, so that's fine. This will explain to you what a Freya model looks like in a humanities classroom. Let's have a look. Okay, so there's the resources, and I'm going to put those up again at the end on another slide in case you missed them. What I want you to do, and so Freya models are they have a basic setup. So usually you have the word in the middle, definition on the top left, and then on the top right, sometimes you have image, or sometimes you can have characteristics or features. And I'd suggest probably in the humanities classroom, we're going to be looking more at the characteristics and features. And then you'll have examples and non-examples to help clarify exactly what that word means. So what I want you to do is just to have a go. Choose one of the words from your list that you found before, and I want you to have a go at filling out the Freya model on page 7 of your book. Now, I will warn you, creating your own definition is actually really hard. So it is recommended that before you do this with the students, that you already come up with a student-friendly definition, because remember, we don't want to use words that our kids don't already have access to in the definition. So have a go at it. I'll put the timer on. I'll put it on for 2 minutes, and just let me know how you go with filling out your own Freya model just for one of the words that you've got in that that you found in the previous activity. Let's have a look. Okay, how did you go with your definition? I'd love to see. Put some of your definitions in the chat, see how difficult it was. Now, the recommendation for using a Freya model is, from past experience, I can tell you don't want to do this for every single word that you're introducing, because the kids will tire of it. Sometimes it is a case of introduce the word and the definition on one day, and then on another day, that's when you're going to pull out and maybe look at examples and non-examples once the students have had more experience with the word. So, and you might save this for the words that you think are really critical to understanding the content that you're presenting. So be picky about when you use it and about how you use it as well. So that's one option, the Freya model. Now, the second option is the part card strategy. This is actually in the science section of the toolkit, but there is a link from the humanities section. So that's why I've chosen to show this as well. The reason that I wanted to talk about this is this idea of generative morphology. Okay, if you're thinking, oh my goodness, what is she even talking about? Doesn't matter. I'm going to explain it to you. So calm down. Generative morphology. So Templeton and Crew say becoming aware of and understanding how prefixes and suffixes combine with roots will support a student's ability to generate knowledge about thousands of words. So do you remember back in school when you learned about prefixes and suffixes? Well, we're going to pull them out again now because particularly in this era of humanities, it's really important, and even more so in, say, geography and the financial field. This idea of morphology and root words, prefixes, and suffixes is really important. You need to teach these generative morphological processes as they apply to the vocabulary of your discipline, because most students do not discover, much less apply them, on their own. Right, what are we talking about? When I'm talking about morphology, morphology is the study of the morphemes in words. Morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning within a word. So we've got prefixes, parts that tack onto the front of the word to change the meaning of the word. Now, we know prefixes like un or non. So non-fiction, we know is non, we know what that means. We know what the non part means. Humanities related prefixes that I've put up here, trans. So when we see the word, when we see the prefix trans on the start of a word, we can have a guess at the meaning of that word. If we know that trans means across, so transplant, transatlantic, transport, so across. We've got neo, meaning new. So we're thinking Neolithic. Well, if I know what neo means, then I've got a bit of a leg up into understanding what Neolithic means. Suffixes, that's what we're putting on the end of the word. So if you think of a suffix like ism, which is a worldview, a belief system, or a system of government. So like communism. And then ist, I-S-T, is a person who believes in that. So someone who believes in communism is a communist. So that helps me to, even though I might not fully understand the word, I've got a bit of an understanding about it because I understand what the prefix or the suffix means. And then we've got roots. So we have, one that I grabbed, liber, I guess is how you'd say it, meaning free. So if we think of words like liberate, liberty, liberal. So, okay, well, I might not know the whole word, but I understand that's got something to do with freedom. So, and then I've got terra, which means earth. So territory. So these are word or parts of words that can help us to unlock the meaning of other words. Now, when we're talking about generative morphology, it's like using that small part. So if we know that pop is referring to people, for using the root pop, then we can look at repopulation. We think, what might that mean? Unpopulated, popular, populance, population. So all of these other words that spring up as an opportunity for us. Remember when I said when you learn one word, you don't just learn that one word? So it's giving us a leg up into a whole bunch of other words if we can understand the small parts within words. All right. If you're thinking, well, this sounds really interesting, but I just do not know the roots of words, there are some really great websites to help you. So ETYM Online is the one that I use, and I go back and it tells you the history of the word. Say, for example, someone said in their words, I think it was, who was it? Consumer. And you had a few other CON words. And I was automatically thinking, wow, I wonder if that CON is a prefix that has a specific meaning. And if I teach that, will it give access to consumerism, consumer, consumption? So I'm thinking that CON on that word has a meaning. And if I can teach my students what that meaning is, then they'll have access to a whole bunch of other words. The other thing is that you might access a book like Words Their Way, which I'll put up at the end. And in there, they have a whole bunch of lists. Say for humanities, here's some prefixes and suffixes that are relevant to this subject area. So unlock the secrets for our students so they can, build their knowledge on this. So the part card strategy builds on the Freya model, except that it has a section on the top right for pulling the word apart to say, what are the parts of this word? So if we look at a word like democracy, 4 syllables, 9 letters, the parts, dem, which is for people, crat or crass is for rule, and the y means it's characterized by. So it's characterized by people having the rule, all right, democracy. So then we've got our student definition and our textbook definition. and then a picture. Well, I didn't draw one. I got one from the internet. That's cheating, but well, it's not, as long as it helps me to understand the word, isn't it? So the other thing is, we've just come off remote learning. I'm thinking, what does a digital version of this look like? I think that'd be really interesting. Can we formulate a digital version of a part card strategy so that our students, when we're accessing these new words, teaching them, can they have a digital diary of them? All right. The final one, I'm just going to introduce, it's just quick sentence stems. Just it's that idea, how Mazzano said that periodically bringing the words out and reusing them. So just at the end, like an exit ticket, I thought that this word meant this, and now I know it means this. Really simple exit ticket. It also helps you to, because when they know the meanings of the words, it helps you to understand more about their knowledge of the content area. Compare what this word means in everyday English, submarine, with what it means in geographical terms or historical terms or, whatever. Choose 3 of the vocabulary terms for this unit and explain how they relate to one of these historical photographs. That was the one that I borrowed from the Shanahan text. So just some quick sentence stems, and it's just about constantly exposing students to those words that you've pulled out as the ones that are really key for the unit that you're teaching. Right. I'm going to skip the reflection because I want to get on to the final part. I've only got a few minutes left, so I hope everyone will forgive me for that. You can totally reflect on this after the I was going to say after the show. It's not really a show. After the webinar. But I do want you to think about, so what? If I heard about all this vocabulary information, how might I tweak my teaching to make sure that I am giving explicit instruction in vocabulary for my students? Do it as a test. See what happens. What happens to your student content knowledge? What happens to their engagement with the text and their engagement with the subject when you take time out, when you quarantine the time to focus on explicit vocabulary instruction? So I think do a little trial, see what impact it has. Would be a worthwhile use of time. Okay, the last section I just want to talk about, and I'm just going to do a light touch on this because there are lots of resources in the toolkit for this, is that idea of explicit genre instruction, okay? So genres or text types that achieve the same social purpose tend to have similar structural patterns. We know that as adults, but sometimes I think our kids don't seem to understand that. They haven't quite worked it out. So when students understand the structures of the different genres as well as the purpose, they're better able to produce text. And I would argue they're better able to read the text as well. So when they know that this is the type of thing they're going to expect in a text when they're reading it, then they're better able to read it because they know, oh, actually you don't have to read this entire text from top to bottom. You can skim through and go to specific sections. Okay, so from the toolkit, just a couple of examples. Civics and citizenship texts are complex as they are comprised of multiple genres and are often multimodal in nature. And if you think about all the remote learning we've just done, how many multimodal texts have our students been exposed to? And how much explicit teaching has there been to teach them how to get the most information and in the most efficient way out of those multimodal or these online texts? So explicitly teaching students about the textual features of various genres will help to improve students' reading, writing, and speaking. It is a good investment of time. Historical texts are complex. Well, we've got economic texts. They have their own language, specialized language and text structures. Okay, we get it. They're all complex. So that means we've got to think about, okay, well, how do I teach it? So there are lots of challenges that our students are facing. Not only are there the vocabulary of the text, but the fact that they interact with the text in different ways in different disciplines. So let's have a look at this. Now, this is particularly relevant if you're a literacy leader in a school and you're supporting content area teachers to work out how to explicitly teach genre. There's a resource that not a whole lot of people know about. This is on the Australian Curriculum website. To be honest, I just Google National Literacy Learning Progressions. I'd write that down. And we might even get my the gurus in the chat to write it down. National Literacy Learning Progressions. Okay, I'm going to show you what it does. So when you Google it, you get to this page. You're going to click on the literacy learning progression and you will get a copy of these slides. So don't worry if you think, oh, I've missed that. Down the bottom, when it'll come up to this page here, you want to go down to view learning area advice, and it provides you with access to information about the links between literacy and each of these content areas. So of course, we're going to look at the humanities section. It's divided into each of these 4. So what happens is when you click on it, you get a PDF document that helps you to understand. So if you're, say, you're a literacy leader and you're working with some humanities teachers, it helps you to understand how literacy knowledge can benefit students who are trying to learn about humanities. How can you work with these teachers to help them to improve the literate practices required in this content area? One of the things that I really love about it is that it says, here are the text types that these kids are likely to encounter in this subject area. So for, which one have I used here? Geography, these are the text types. So the purpose is to inform. This is the text type family. These are the actual text types. And here's some examples of the purposes. This is gold. It means you don't have to know everything about the whole content area. So what I've done is I've just put it on a chart here to show you what that website says, and these are on the toolkit as well, to say these are the text types that your students are likely to read and write in your area. Holy moly, that is a lot. And this is another reason why we can't expect the English teacher to be teaching all these things to our students. Wow, look at all of those. And there are some areas of crossover, but there are also some areas that are specific to that discipline as well. So persuasive, for example, yes, you might be writing an exposition, but it might look different in geography than what it does in history, okay? So how do we build student knowledge on these text types? Well, we go right back to gradual release, and we've got to say, have we built our students have we started at the top, and have we demonstrated for them? Have we helped them, and then have we given them the support so they can do it on their own? So I think I've put 6 steps on here for explicit genre instruction. Number 1, and these you can find these in the toolkit in most of the humanities areas. You've got to immerse students in examples of the genre. They need to see mentor texts. If we're asking our students to create a, let's say, persuasive argument about I don't know, something that happened in history, our students need to see some examples of persuasive arguments. They need to see what we're on about so they can go, oh, okay, I can see how that works now. We want students to analyze the key features. So let's have a look at 3 different arguments and let's see what's similar about them in terms of the structure of it, in terms of the vocabulary of it, in terms maybe even of tense. What type of tense do they use? So this helps the students to build a bit of a recipe for, okay, well, this is what a good argument looks like, because now I've seen a few different ones. Now I'm getting a bit of a recipe, so I know when I write in this same text type, I know what a good one looks like, so I can aim towards that. You could provide a guide to the students to say, here are the text features of a specific type of text type, and then give the students, so let me have a look at this next one. On the Civics and Citizenship page, they've given an example for an analytical exposition. So they've said, these are the components of an analytical exposition. There's a background, this is what it does. There's a thesis statement, this is what it does. There are a series of arguments, and then there's a reinforcing position. So we can have that printed out in front of us, and then we're going to provide our students with some examples of them, and we want them to match up. Okay, I've told you that these often start with a background. I want you to highlight in this text, where is the background part? I want you to highlight where is their thesis statement, where are their series of, where are the arguments, and where's the reinforcing position? What do you notice about each of those things? So we've got to, rather than diving straight down to the bottom of the gradual release and saying, you write one, we've got to pull them right back up the top and say, let's have a look at some other people's ones first, so we can craft from those, because they've been published or they're experts in the field, so that our students have much better understanding about what are we talking about? What does success look like? Okay, we need lots of talk around this rather than just saying, write an analytical exposition, go. So there are lots of resources in the toolkit to help you to do this. The Civics and Citizenship page has a great example, but also that the 4th page, the tying it all together, lots of supporting resources there to show you for one specific text type what that could look like. That was the whirlwind tour of that. Right, just to finish up, the resources, if you want to further your knowledge on disciplinary literacy, you will go to, these are 3 of the texts that you might use. So we've got, this is disciplinary literacy in action, and adolescent literacy in the academic disciplines. So there are 3 texts that you can use to build your knowledge on each of in the area of disciplinary literacy. These are particularly relevant if you are a literacy coach or literacy leader in a school and you're working with a bunch of different teachers from different curriculum areas. Looking at the vocabulary resources, if you want to go deeper into that, these are 3 texts that you could have a look at. Vocabulary for middle and secondary teachers, the words their way. So in this text, this is also really good for, well, good for content area teachers and good for literacy leaders, because they actually go deep onto each content area in secondary school, and they talk about the how and the why of the content area, of the vocabulary in that content area. They give you some lists of usually of prefixes and suffixes that are relevant to that. Lots of really good information. Building academic vocabulary isn't quite as dense, but it's a nice, easy read, so somewhere to start. And Vocabularians is also a nice, easy read. So there's some recommendations that I've got. All right, understanding goals. Let's see how let's go back to the success criteria. How do we go? I can describe reasons why explicit teaching of disciplinary literacy is important in the humanities classroom, and I would argue in any classroom. List a range of practical literacy-related activities. Reflect on your current literacy-related teaching practices. And my apologies for skipping the second and third reflection. I didn't want to go over time. And list a range of supporting resources for ongoing learning. This is just the start of your journey. So I'm hoping that you can go into the toolkit now, have a little look around, look at the other areas of the toolkit, look in science and maths. They've got some really great resources in there. And maybe further your knowledge with with one of the books that I've recommended, and go out and give it a try. So from here, we've put a link in the chat to please provide please answer the survey about tonight's toolkit webinar. You'll be sent a copy of the slides after tonight. Otherwise, that's it from me. Enjoy the rest of the term, everyone, and good luck using the toolkit. Good night.